Hey everyone, I hope everyone is doing good and taking good care of themselves. So today I have great honor of welcoming Dr. Callum Cooper on our YouTube channel. And I personally have interest in parapsychology. So, I mean, who else better than, Dr. Cal Cooper, to guide us and educate us on this subject. So Dr. Cooper is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Northampton, a chartered psychologist and one of the UK's leading researchers in parapsychology and thanatology, the scientific study of death and dying. And his work explores areas, often considered too mysterious, sometimes a taboo subject, a taboo topic. I mean, for the mainstream science, like, near-death experiences, after-death communication, apparition, and the psychology of spirituality. What makes Dr. Cooper's contribution so remarkable is the way he combines academic rigor with deep humanity, treating experiences that many dismiss as fringe with both scientific seriousness and compassion. He's also the author of, the very famous book Telephone Calls from the Dead. Plus, he has co-authored a lot other books as well. And I mean, it's going to be a great conversation. Dr. Cal, thank you so much for joining in today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Cal, one of the most enduring questions in both science and spirituality is whether consciousness survives bodily death, while materialism often dismisses it, outrightly dismisses it. But, parapsychology, on the other hand, has been, willing to take the question seriously. I mean, somewhat seriously. So, Dr. Cooper, from your years of, working with spontaneous case studies, which kinds of experiences or patterns most convincingly suggest that consciousness might survive, physical death?
Well, I suppose the answer to that question comes from the recent Bigelow essay competition and what scored the highest in it. So the aerospace entrepreneur, Robert Bigelow in Las Vegas, he put forward various prize levels, and the biggest one was first place, $500,000, so $500,000, for the best 25,000 word essay demonstrating with supported evidence life after death. And then there was a second and third place and loads of runners up. And many parapsychologists worldwide were invited to take part, and others could apply that showed at least 6 years of engagement within this particular field. So I think there were a number of rejections, but 206 essays went through for judging. So you can imagine this went on for some time. There was a lot, and I mean a lot of essays there, if they're all 25,000 words each, for all the judges to read. And the judges were made up of well-informed journalists, psychologists, physicists, medical doctors. It was quite a variety of different people on the panel. And the top prizes, the top one went to Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove, who hosts New Thinking Aloud, co-directs parapsychology education with me at the Californian Institute for Human Science. But if you look for these higher prizes, the things that come out the most, I think there's two particular things that were really quite compelling to the judges. And number one was live demonstrations in the laboratory of mediumship, where there might be double-blind or even triple-blind procedures to stop sensory leakage in anyone knowing generic information, or using things such as just cold reading, where you're reading the person in front of you, you're picking up on body language cues and making very vague statements that they are finding meaningful when they're not at all. Or Barnum scripts as well, just coming out with scripts of general information. It's going beyond that, and they're putting controls in place. And you have someone actively there making the claim that they are receiving information allegedly from the dead. So some of those live demonstrations, the lab studies that were culminated into these essays, impressed the judges. And then some unique cases of reincarnation, particularly where children have come forward round about the age of 3, 4, 5, that they're starting to pick up their own language and speaking fluently, and then start telling their parents, their guardians, that there is another version of them. They have another family. You're my mum and dad, and I love you, but I love my other mum and dad. They may start talking about a death, other siblings, another town. And uniquely, some of these children are only one town away, in many cases, from where they claimed that they were as this former individual. They may present xenoglossy, which is fluently speaking in a language that you've never been taught, and relate to the previous individual. They may have intricate skills such as music, playing flute or piano without ever having been taught perfectly. They just pick it up and do it, and it relates to the previous individual. And scars and deformations in birth, like underdeveloped or non-developed hands or feet, and yet the previous person had the same, or they had their hand cut off in the stages of however they died. So all these things added up that interested people like psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson and many others years ago. So mediumship and reincarnation were really, in all the essays, at the forefront of the most compelling things for the judges. We wrote on a number of things, though. Deathbed experiences, when people are dying and they claim a visitation from loved ones, even loved ones they don't know as they're dying, have just died recently within a few hours or a few days, and no one wanted to tell the dying individual. And yet this visitation has delivered specific information to them. Day-to-day apparitions, haunted locations, poltergeists, you name it. We looked at a number of different scenarios and tried to really trawl through the text and pull out the best evidence to see where we are today. And some of the better essays, I think, where are we today, by bridging with things like neuroscience as well. If you've got that medium claiming this active channeling with the dead, what's happening in their brain at the time that they're doing that? Is there anything that's, untoward, unusual? What's going on? That's really where our new learning curve is. Parapsychology is really starting to hold hands firmly with things like neuroscience.
Cal, across cultures, I have seen the bereaved often, describes dreams, a kind of visitations, apparitions of their loved ones. Some, call it a kind of a grief hallucination. And, others see them as evidences of survival. I mean, some kind of a coping or something, just to survive and, pass through that phase. I would like to know, Cal, how do you differentiate between grief-related phenomena and what you would consider genuine after-death communication? And before you dive deep, could you please share an example that really stayed with you?
Well, grief-related phenomena, I mean, the side effects of grief are innumerable. You could go on for pages and pages of things that people can have. We all say people grieve in their own way. That there could be things like not wanting to socialize, not wanting to associate with the things in which the deceased passed away, driving cars anymore, motorbikes, extreme sports, taking the bus, taking a plane, taking a boat, oversensitiveness to noise, loss of appetite, sexual impotency, not wanting to go out with friends, not looking after yourself, health and hygiene starts to drop, not looking after your diet, not sleeping well. There are so many things that could come from grief and a reaction to that. And I could go down so many routes. I mean, one of the people that really fanned the flames of a fire that already existed in terms of the data that we had on people seeing apparitions after someone had died, dreaming of them after they died, sensing their presence, hearing them, you name it. We already had that data for years and years and years with the Society for Psychical Research. And one of their biggest surveys that took place in the late 1880s, called the Report on the Census of Hallucinations, which came out in volume 10 of their proceedings. And that was a postal survey, even back then, to 17,000 individuals. Really impressive stuff. And 10% of those reported in the affirmative to post-death type experiences, which included sense of presence. But it was in the 1970s that a GP, a general practitioner doctor, who would be at your local surgery that is for the community, and you go and see them as a first port of call, William Dewi Rees. He was based in North Wales, already held this doctorate status as a general practitioner, but wanted to be more engaged in research. Like I've heard from yourself, Sarah, it's like doing PhDs and active research, and therapy is one thing, research is another thing, and you collect the data to inform therapy, but therapy can tell us more about how to better do the research. Everything goes hand in hand, and he wanted to do a bit more of the research. And so he goes back to King's College London, wanting to take on a research MD thesis looking at the negative outcomes of bereavement. And School of Medicine don't quite want it through formal medicine, but they shift it into psychiatry, still under the banner of medicine, of course. And he does the thesis, and as he interviews 293 widows and widowers from his local surgery, he discovers towards the end of the interviews that some of them said, oh yeah, and after they're gone, I still felt them around me in some way. So he decides to re-interview them all asking this question, did you feel a sense of presence or anything after this person had gone? These people had never been asked before. Out of the 293 widows and widowers, only one person had ever confided in someone else, and it was a clergyman. So they feared psychosis, ridicule if they mentioned they're sensing the presence of the dead, dreaming about them, smelling their perfumes or tobaccos, hearing their voice. And he found that about 55% were reporting anything from sensing the presence of the dead all the way through to seeing their apparition. And so there's been a lot of generic conventional explanations or attempted skepticism put on some of these experiences from outside researchers saying, well, you've only seen the apparition because you're at a loss. You're longing for more contact. It's expectancy and anticipation. You're back in the home. It's all their stuff's there. Photographs of them are there. You expect them to dip their head round the corner and ask if you'd like a cup of tea. You know, the suggestion is that they're still there. You can still smell them. It's everything. It's their domain. So of course you're going to have these experiences. But that doesn't explain why would a group of people unrelated to the bereavement see the apparition? Why would the apparition come forward with very specific information that the bereaved know nothing about? And they have to look it up, and it turns out to be true. So this is where psychology of bereavement overlaps to the parapsychology or clinical parapsychology of bereavement, where, yes, we are interested in the bereavement aspects. Clinical parapsychology looks at how these experiences impact you, but the parapsychology element is, well, why did other people see it? They're not involved in the bereavement. Why would people in the funeral industry have those experiences? They're not going through a loss. This is their job. And where's that specific information coming from? So bereavement is a very broad spectrum of how that influences these experiences. There's probably many factors of conventional bereavement that make it look like someone's having a strange experience, but we have to look at each case on its merits to see, have we got anything that just simply does not seem to fit the bill of what we know of bereavement as it stands?
Cal, I would also like to know, what are your views? I mean, is everyone capable of such a communication, or it's only triggered with grief, trauma, or when, there is porosity? I mean, when, we are permeable. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we did another survey. It came out in 2021 in the British Journal of Psychiatry. That was a survey of just over 1,000 people in English, French, and Spanish-speaking languages. We're still doing that research, and it's now gone to Chinese, Dutch, and German. And within that survey, we did have people that could relate to experiences of interacting with someone after they died, but they didn't know the individual that had died. An apparition came to them of someone they didn't recognize. And so it was not completely grief related. So we do have these absolute curveballs where they just don't seem to fit the bill. Again, with Dewi Rees and his thesis, which ended up as a paper in the British Medical Journal in 1971, he said that age, race, religion, belief systems, they don't seem to affect whether someone's going to have one of these experiences or not, which fits perfectly with why, since the beginnings of the Society for Psychical Research, we've called these spontaneous cases. If you're in the right place at the right time, it just spontaneously happens. All we do know is, from a lot of research over time with parapsychology and looking at the life to the lab and trying to translate the anecdotes of day-to-day life and how we could fit this into a lab-based study, we know that when people are in an altered state of consciousness, or even just those nice day-to-day ones, which we would call being content, or flow, which is spoken about by Malay Csikszentmihalyi in his book, Flow, The Psychology of Happiness, those slight altered states, watching the television, working on some writing, washing the pots, gardening, doing little jobs where your mind is focused, but you're content. Time is flying as you're having fun. You're just perfectly happy. Those are the perfect times in which to have an experience, or the hypnagogic state as you go to sleep, or hypnopompic state as you wake up, just between the two as it's wavering. So in lab studies, when we try and do tests for psychic functioning, we use techniques such as the Gansfeld or other meditative techniques or flotation tanks. We want people to hover in that state. We want to induce an altered state artificially because, from what we know, it seems to be psych-conducive. And it seems to be producing as well some very interesting results from those lab-based studies. So day-to-day, altered states, that just slightly in the right frame of mind. Doesn't matter if you're a believer in the paranormal, you're slightly skeptical or healthily skeptical, or absolute cynic who just doesn't want to see the data. I don't want to hear the stories. I don't want to see any evidence. I just know it's not happening. It may happen to that person regardless because they're in the right place at the right time. Surveys I've done have shown that anyone on that end of the spectrum has had the experience, and it really challenged the viewpoints of people who were dead against that these things happen or that there's any written evidence or data for them. It really stopped and made them think about life and actually looking at data and listening to people's experiences.
Cal, Carl Jung reminded us that humans are symbolic beings, constantly, seeking patterns and meanings, especially around loss. Now, how do you see symbolic cognition shaping people's interpretation of near-death or paranormal experiences? And can symbols, even if subjective, still point us toward the real phenomena?
Well, there's a lot of again, if we stick with the ADCs, there's a lot of symbolic experiences that people have taken from ADCs, and also synchronicities as well within them. So one of the common ones for ADCs has been noticing coins, spare change suddenly appearing. Either it's suddenly appeared on the sideboard or the table, or they hear it drop, and yet they believe they don't keep spare change around the house. Or they're working away at the laptop and all of a sudden a white feather suddenly comes down in front of them, and someone has either just passed away and they don't know about it, which is really interesting. We call those crisis cases. Or someone has passed away and it might be on their mind or slightly towards the back of their mind, depending on what stage in grief they're at. But they will quite often interpret this as some sort of message from the dead. That this is exact symbolism. For outside, it could be a robin redbreast bird suddenly sits close by on a spade as you're gardening and is watching over you and is very friendly. And people have taken that as an idea that the soul of the deceased has gone into the bird. Butterflies as well, which is also a beautiful metaphor for the whole life cycle, with the caterpillar through to chrysalis and then reinvented. Um, like a very much, the whole status of immortality and just being reborn again. That you've gone from chrysalis to something else. You've translated. Still, is it the same consciousness, the same mind? All those kinds of thoughts that we've had over years and years and years. This symbolism has existed through into some of these parapsychological experiences. There's some people that are very diehard Carl Jung fans when it comes to how we deal with the whole idea about parapsychological phenomena and dualism.
Mm-hmm.
I think for my training as a psychologist, I certainly followed more of Carl Jung's ideas when it came to developmental psychology. And I just know that he was far more pro-parapsychology, way more than Freud was. But both of them had contributed to the Society for Psychical Research. Freud was just very much afraid that psychoanalytic theory would get very much damaged by the developing nature of parapsychology. He associated it as, well, this will just all get grouped together with Conan Doyle and fairies at the bottom of the garden and telepathy and things that we don't have any hard evidence for. So we're really trying to create a basis here for a science. Deal with it in your own time, Carl Jung. Do it over there, I'm not sure, but sure enough, towards the end of Freud's life, he was interested in it. He even admitted that if he had his time again, he may have pursued parapsychology, but he was so embedded in what he created for himself, which was going down psychoanalytic theory.
Yeah. I recently completed his Red Book, and trust
Oh,
me,
well done.
there is so many. I was so curious. It was in my list, and I completed, and I was like, "Wow, he is way too ahead of his time." Philemon, and then Abraxas, and wow. Too much of experiences that he had, and hats off to him. He had the courage to write it. I often have such experiences, but I feel shy. What if I'm pathologized? Oh, she's a little schizophrenic. She's having some episode, this and that. Because that's what happens. People are not so open about these things. But of course, geniuses like you are actually, doing great work and creating awareness. So, Cal, I personally feel that the boundary between life and death often seems more porous than once we thought. And this is what I'm saying from my own personal experience, particularly the near-death experience, and experiences and perceptions during clinical death. I had a near-death experience, and after that experience, I'm not the same person. I personally feel I have access to things which I did not have access earlier. And I am still the same person, but different at the same time. Now, Cal, I would like to know, which NDE cases do you find most scientifically compelling? I mean, something which is like really compelling, no one can dismiss. I mean, it's like etched in stone kinds. And what do they suggest about the nature of consciousness, if you could, simplify it for the viewers?
Well, I'm not an exact expert on the NDE, even though I'm a parapsychologist, and I cover the whole topics throughout our modules and so forth. There's certain elements that I do specialize in and others that I don't. And so NDEs is certainly one of my weaknesses, along with outer body experiences as well. But we've forever mentioned the Pam Reynolds case. And you might be familiar with that, where she was undergoing surgery for an aneurysm. And so we've got this blood escaping around the body. And during that procedure, they drain her brain of blood. Now, the brain is surviving because of the oxygen and the nutrients that the blood supplies as it goes into the brain, and it constantly needs this. So if viewers might be aware, they might not be aware that, but 6 minutes is our threshold without that being supplied. Beyond 6 minutes, irreversible damage can start to occur, and it can affect all sorts of things. We don't know which way it's going to go. It starts with cognitive ability, or it could start to affect our motor control and our speech and memory, all sorts of things. But it starts to die off. The brain permanently goes to sleep in some regions. If it's too long, you're just dead. That's it. There is no recovery except for vegetation and artificial life support. So near death is a really important term. You are near to the point of death. You haven't actually died beyond that 6 minutes. The brain is still feeding off the nutrients and the oxygen, but it's critical situation time. You need hands-on support. You need CPR, someone doing compressions and breathing in your mouth, or some sort of medical intervention beyond that to help you, the heart actually doing its own thing again. And so Pam Reynolds' case is very interesting. The brain during the surgery is absolutely drained of blood, and yet she claims various things about items and where they are, intricate conversations between physicians and nurses, and has remained a very powerful case that has compelled a lot of people, and seemingly led to studies where people started putting items on top of shelves in rooms where people were terminally ill or they were on their deathbed, seeing if when they went in to see that person, if they could actually state about things being in the room high up as though they'd left their body during sleep and then come back to it. All these ideas started to fascinate people. There was also the case of Chris Robinson, I think it is, in the UK. He'd had a heart attack in the 1980s, and after he was revived, he claimed precognitive abilities, mainly during his sleep. So he'd have very intricate dreams that related to future events that he realized were coming true. So when he has given talks, and there might be the side of the skeptics that have started to look at him, and they may have their own argument as well, but he's not been afraid to be put to the test by researchers. He's gone to the police when he's had these visions of someone's going to be shot and murdered. He claims that he knew when the TV presenter Jill Dando was going to be shot before it happened. He'd had visions about the World Trade Centers in 9/11 and the planes hitting them before it happened. And he'd gone to New Scotland Yard and told them, wanted to write formal statements. He got government agents up in planes at the time asking if he had any more information about other planes coming down. And this is all following a heart attack and, going near to death. Some of the more compelling cases, though, I like that are called ADCs, very rarely called ADCs, but it was Professor Peter Fenwick, who was a neuropsychiatrist, and he wrote a book with his wife Elizabeth Fenwick called The Art of Dying. And they mentioned some people that have gone beyond that 6 minute threshold. And I'd even heard of cases where people have been in the morgue, inside the fridge, the cooler, waiting for autopsy. So for them to be cut open and organs weighed and reports made as to the manner in which they died, they were reported dead. And they were in the cooler, and on being taken out, just as the scalpel blade goes down for autopsy, their eyes open and they're rushed back to theatre. And some of those people are claiming that they knew everything that was going on during that time. So our duty as skeptics is to question, what do we know about medical science at that point? How could that slip the net? Are they not in some sort of intricate hibernated state that we just simply don't know about? Or are they genuinely dead and somehow woken up because that goes beyond what we know of the nutrients needing to be going around the brain. This brain is not being fed for hours, and it's cooled down because it's in the fridge, it's in the cooler. So these are remarkable cases that, as skeptics, as psychologists, demand our attention to look at these case studies and break down what on earth is going on. Does it actually have some conventional explanations we've not considered, or is there something more to learn? Your final question on that point, though, was what does it tell us about the nature of consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
Researchers, early spiritualists of the time, they all had this idea of when you die, consciousness starts to go higher and higher through these planes of existence and interconnectivity with other information. There's all sorts of ideas: metempsychosis, transmigration. This information is not lost; it just becomes in this memory bank, like radio waves, and ideas like the morphic field. That there's just this exchange. There's this field of everything: your personality, your memory, your intellect. And the longer it's there, the more intelligent it becomes, just being connected with the universe. So some people report experiences like your own, where they've had a near-death experience and they feel a bit more refined, like they've had a touch of extra information and enlightenment, and things start to make more sense. And also the comfort that death would bring, rather than the anxiety and pain and suffering that death may bring. When actually they realize, oh, it's the opposite. Pain, suffering, and hardship, and working hard at life and finding contentment and learning it is life. Comfort and just contentment is through death. There's no pain or suffering there. People feel interconnected. They feel just eternal sleep and peace. You know, it's a kind of it's more of a pleasant experience than dealing with the hardships of life. And you know, whether it be accidents that we go through or just old age and our body steadily giving up and our brain steadily giving up, that's things that we have to adapt and learn to, these hardships and struggles. So yeah, people feel this interconnectivity of consciousness and an enlightened consciousness. Just like when sometimes people have an enlightenment experience through psychedelics as well, when they've had such a good trip through whatever they may have had: LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin, you name it, whatever it may be. Sometimes people just have one particular one where it's their first big one, just like getting to a really good peak and meditating for years and years and years and discovering some sort of enlightenment that just says, right, that's making sense now. This makes absolute sense now to me, what life and death is really all about. And I'm going from what I've read and what I've heard. I mean, I haven't had these kinds of experiences. I love it when I have a good night's sleep, but I haven't taken psychedelics. I've never had a near-death experience. I don't meditate, but I get involved in these studies. I've done Gansfeld. I've been in flotation tanks many, many, many times. I'm always doing flotation tanks. I know how to be content, and I know when I'm content, we might have a good score when it comes to ESP. For some reason, what you're hallucinating seems to relate well to the targets. And so I'm figuring out things at a slower pace than yourself with the near-death experience and other people that have reached this point of enlightenment.
True. And I would also like to add something over here, Cal. You mentioned psychedelics, shrooms, or, other kind of substances that people often take and have, different kind of experiences. I have personally felt that, anesthesia does something similar as well. If you are undergoing general anesthesia, I mean, I have personally felt, and I have, interacted with individuals who feel a little different after undergoing a major surgery. And it's they wake up with a lot of new information, and this is fascinating. In one situation, you are experiencing high and you are taking some substance or psychedelics, and then you are actively experiencing, but over here you're absolutely knocked out, and then when you wake up you have a whole bunch of realization and different things to assess and understand. Now, Cal, I personally have observed that belief in spirits and apparition appear in every culture and historical period, and that universality suggests something deeper than just cultural imagination.
Yeah.
Do cross-cultural apparitional accounts share any consistent feature that hint at a common mechanism, according to you, whether psychological or neurological or transpersonal?
Common mechanism is a really tricky one. Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove has said to our students recently that parapsychology has often been described as a science that has a lot of data but no theory. And that is the problem, that we don't have a working model for how things are occurring. But you raise a really good point of not only these experiences being cross-cultural to all humanity, but also quite timeless. When we go back to ancient civilizations, you can see reports in papyrus scrolls, sometimes tablets, of people having visions of the future, interacting with the dead. And it's only the introduction and development of various religions of human creation that we've added different interpretations onto these, which can then skew how we understand them. But if you strip away the religious meaning and explanation, just look purely at the human phenomenology of these experiences, they are very similar, not only cross-cultural, but throughout hundreds of years for documentation. There are just some slight variations, and again, I still wonder whether it's down to just spins in religious texts on them. So I looked at apparitions in ancient Egypt, and then we've got through to Islamic and Christian culture today. But going back to the ancient traditions, they sort of had three different kinds of ghosts. There was the Ka, the Ku, and the Ba, and so that the Ka was like the exact double of you. It would be an apparition as we know it today. Someone would interact with it and sometimes not realize until afterwards that they'd seen an apparition. The Ku was more this spiritual essence that left you, and relates, I suppose, in modern day to when people say they've seen the apparition of the lady in white or the grey lady or the blue lady, and it's just a mist, a haze. Well, the psychologist in me says, well, has that person got an eye condition? Is it Charles Bonnet syndrome and a blurring of vision? Or infrasound in the environment, and that's creating a blurring of vision, but in the same place. It's, that's an infrasound matter. It's a location-based matter. But they've started to talk about this. People seeing misty, hazy things that they believe comes out of the body. And then the Ba, which is the heart, the soul essence, which they also believe is the seat of consciousness as well, because of the ancient Egyptians removing brain matter, partly because it didn't help mummification. It decomposed very badly and hindered the mummification process. They believed awareness and life force was in the heart. It was physical. You could feel the heartbeat. It was a very meaningful thing. And so the Ba goes on to judgment in the path of the afterlife as well. But in modern culture of Egypt, and then in other places as well through Islamic tradition, I was looking at things like the jinns or the genies, and then also the afri. So the jinns were often described as intruders and not very nice entities when they turned up. And they're mentioned in the Quran as being created by Allah before man, and they were created from smokeless fire and hot winds. And these kind of spiritual entities just came out of nowhere, out of this development before man. And then the Afri are very unusual in terms of them being ghost-like creatures that, when confronted with humans, grow in size, making noises, strange noises that they do. We don't typically have ghosts growing in size, but we do have people that talk about negative energies in a haunted location or a spirit with evil intent. Well, let's face it, how many people alive are good people and how many people are bad people? We've got good and bad people that are empathic and people that just live for themselves. So I imagine if they have died and are surviving, then this attitude may persist, and they just do what they want and they run reckless and upset people and scare them. But absolutely, going back, strip away that religious interpretation. Cross-culturally, humans have been very much inbuilt to have these experiences, to note them down and be aware of them, and all around the world as well, which is really interesting. I think a lot more work can be done in that area as to what's going on there. I started talking about this in Para-Anthropology, which was edited by Dr. Jack Hunter. And it's a good overlap, because I think anthropology, that's got a lot to contribute, especially to indigenous cultures and the ancient civilizations, as to why do we have these experiences? Why are they important? And complement a bit of psychology, but really, what do these experiences mean to our lives and culture, and how they developed over time, and how do they differ from one culture to the next?
Cal, you have navigated both academic rigor and topics, many dismiss as fringe. And trust me, that's a rare balance. What has been your experience of presenting evidence, when it comes to survival phenomena within academia? And how do you handle skepticism without diluting the data?
So I'm very much a diehard skeptic. I've always loved the process in any branch of psychology, especially when I was starting out in my training, of looking for the best methods. Are we applying the best methods possible to deal with whatever we're studying, or are we missing something and actually we're getting data that is related to something else, and we think we've got what we're looking for, and actually something's leaked through, or we've misinterpreted the data, or whatever. Critically look through everything. Are we doing it the best way possible, and have we outsourced every possible alternative explanation, as opposed to what we're actually looking for? So it's like you're trying to explain away your hypothesis. You're trying to block it off from being possible, and seeing if it still persists, which is great, because then maybe you have a legitimate phenomena in psychology in general. So for parapsychology, it's been interesting. I've dealt with that. It's one of my main focuses of research, but I deal with death, dying, and bereavement, which we call thanatology. I deal with human sexual behavior, and I deal with positive psychology as well. But parapsychology can complement a number of fields. The Parapsychology Foundation, every year, used to run a conference where it would be parapsychology and communication, parapsychology and education, parapsychology and clinical psychology. Every year, how does it branch and complement? And so when I started off in my career, there was always the concerns that, well, do parapsychology on the side, or add a bit of it into your PhD, but specialize in a research method or some other area of psychology, just so you've got many strings to your bow. And I'd still agree with that now. You're not going to get very far with any PhD that has just got a single track focus and doesn't show off your skills as a researcher in a few different things. It's good to have many strings to your bow and be good at a few different things. You can't be a master of everything, but you can at least spend a good amount of time on a few things that complement each other, so you know how they all work. And then skip forward years later, I do a lot more media work, which suits me because my background's performing arts, and I like doing TV and media. I like going to
Wow.
speak to audiences, and so that allows me to take science data and papers and try and turn them into presentations or public talks where I can make them digestible and speak to an audience. One of my most recent ones, I go around Skeptics in the Pub, which is a national branch that you go to various pubs and give talks to members of the public, some of which are scientists, others are members with kind of various other jobs, but they've all got a common interest on skepticism on various matters of science in general. So I go and throw various parapsychology in there, and sometimes these groups are run by the Humanist Society, Humanist UK. And the most recent one in Sheffield, I was talking about these strange occurrences of telephone phenomena, be it from the living or from the dead. And it unsettled some of the humanists because, as you can imagine, humanists do not believe in life after death. And yet there I am saying, number one, I'm a psychologist. Number two, I'm a skeptic. Number three, as a psychologist, I have a duty to address these concerns because people are reporting them. They're real people reporting what they believe to be real experiences, and therefore they have real consequence. So it's my ethical and moral duty to actually listen to them and try and help and find out what's going on, be it the phenomena or just their own personal well-being. So this phenomena is suggesting something very unusual. Do we have a conventional explanation for it, or is something else going on? Let's look at some of the cases and break them down. So it made some of them really itch. So I got some really challenging questions at the end where they said, your presentation was deeply disturbing. I don't believe in this evidence whatsoever. But it's like they were making up their mind that I was promoting it or supporting the idea that people do survive after death, which I don't find a very comfortable idea. I don't necessarily follow that line that people consciously survive death. What I do follow is that these are things that we need to follow up. They're important things to pay attention to. Sweeping them under the carpet is just very defeatist and not showing moral obligation to our own field of science. And so I had to re-emphasize that, and people were getting it. I was like re-educating a group of people whose remit is not to believe in life after death, to get them to understand and appreciate why it's important to at least consider and understand why people think or can present evidence that they believe is a life after death type experience, and why parapsychology would deal with that. And parapsychology's got some people that are very pro survival of death. They think it's very much been evidenced through how much evidence we've got, and the Bigelow essays I mentioned at the start of this. Or they could be absolute skeptics, or people constantly sitting on the fence like myself that's challenging everything that comes along. So it can be challenging presenting this data. But now more and more universities are opening up. There's a dozen universities in the UK doing talk classes on parapsychology within psychology. There's probably another dozen after that that can support research degrees because of people there that have done PhDs in parapsychology or with elements of it. So they can support Masters of Philosophy, PhDs, and other doctorates. And we're just starting to grow education for parapsychology again in the United States. So the California Institute for Human Science, we've got a concentration path there for a master's and PhD in parapsychology. And I teach at the CIIS as well, the Californian Institute for Integral Studies. They've got a module in parapsychology. And I think
Wow.
other places will be coming back with more support for PhDs as well, the more researchers we've got there. The University of West Georgia, for example, has Professor Christine Simmons-Moore, who was one of the first PhDs in parapsychology out of the University of Northampton, where I'm permanently based. So things are growing and conversation is opening up rather than being shut down. We don't achieve anything by staying quiet and not engaging. That makes things worse with anything. Issues, health concerns, being quiet does nothing. Being able to talk and open up and address concerns and share ideas and different points of view, that's progress.
Cal, I personally feel parapsychology challenges not only, the materialist science, but also research methods themselves. Now, I would like to know, what do you think, are the biggest misconceptions about scientific work on consciousness survival? And how can we, as scholars, engage in this field responsibly without slipping into dogma?
Well, I think there's a big misconception that parapsychology is using unrecognized methods, which is absolutely not true. I mean, a science is based on the methods that it uses, though, as Professor Chris Rowe tells me as well, that there are some exceptions because medicine sometimes uses new and innovative methods that aren't recognized in the pursuit of truth and what's going on with the data. But generally, for the social sciences, we have to conform to known methodologies of dealing with our data, be it numbers or words and written script, so a quantitative or a qualitative route. Parapsychology, when it was forming as a science in the 1920s at Duke University under Joseph Banks Rhine and Louisa Rhine, they started to introduce methodologies and practices that have been integrated into general psychology use. Shielding, randomization, probability theory and testing. And then later on, things such as meta-analyses started to become a big thing, particularly with Charles Honiton and the meta-analyses that he started to produce on Ganzfeld studies. All of these things are standard. We work, when we talk about probability in any study in psychology, that whatever we're testing has to be to 1 in 20 chance, 0.05. And the standard level that Rhyme worked with when he began, and many other areas of psychology were still dealing with talk therapy and a lot of Freudian and Jungian ideas, because this is the 1920s, they're suddenly using constant statistics and getting the statisticians involved. And he was trying to get participants with card guessing experiments to beat a 1 in 200 chance. 0.05, 0.005. That was the standard. You would struggle to this day to get any standard psychology study to beat a 1 in 200 chance. We have medicine works to 0.001. So we're trying to, beat that 1 in 100 for drug trials and things like that. Parapsychology was going higher, and it all mellowed down. It eventually started to drop down. We ended up with this 1 in 20 chance. And so this is integrated. This is now part of general social science, and few people realize that this is thanks to the development of psychical research into parapsychology, formal university study, because they were trying to make very rigorous methodology, very strong watertight methodologies that were better than general psychology. We even have some statistician and parapsychologists, particularly Jessica Utz. She was the former president of the American Statistical Association. And she's talked about how much data in one of her presidential addresses in 2016, how much data there is for parapsychology supporting these ideas. And she said it's strange how there are a lot of people who deny that the data is supporting telepathy or precognition. And she said this wouldn't be the case if this phenomena related to something more mundane. All the more mundane things we deal with in psychology, it's because we're dealing with these non-material processes. and they're written in fiction. You see them in films. They're all fanciful ideas for a lot of people. They think it's, all science and magic mixed together. It can't possibly be happening. But if this data existed in the rest of psychology to that level of replication, we would have a ridiculous amount of data for something on memory or people's interaction in society, some sort of social psychology study. We wouldn't do that many replications. And so I think, a lot of the pseudoscience claims or woo-woo are bizarre now. I've heard some of them. Oh, you don't know how to handle the data correctly. You've misunderstood the phenomena. You haven't been able to replicate it, therefore it's not going on. I've seen far more replications in parapsychology for a given phenomena than I have in general psychology, where I've seen successes and failures here, there, and everywhere, and loads of replications by undergraduate students that haven't been able to replicate something that is written in stone for a lot of people. But that really rings true with the British Psychological Society, when about 5 or 6 years ago they did that big replication study of 300 well-known topics of psychology and studies, and looked at replication, and only 30% of things we thought are taken as read, they're set in stone, those are things that are definitely happening, 30% were replicable. And yet they're not things that we regularly replicate. We just accepted them. You look at Gansfeld studies in parapsychology or the recent Daryl Bem stuff with precognition, it's hundreds of studies and counting. So I think we've done really well to hold our ground and show that not only are we a serious science, we're actually a lot more tougher in our research methods and people skilled in data analysis for qual and quantitative data than a lot of other areas, because we are really serious about the replications, the money that we get in, seeing these studies all the way through to the finish, because we get very little funding to do them, and always talking about replications and even null findings has always been the remit. We talk about any success or failure, because again, open discussion like that is going to create advances, not closing discussion down.
Cal, in my own clinical work, I notice clients often hesitate to share visitation experiences. I was also there. I used to hesitate. And I was scared of being pathologized. Even the clients are scared of being pathologized, that something is wrong, she's gone nuts, there's something wrong. But, at the same time, after those experiences, we see that it brings, a kind of a deep comfort to these individuals, especially, with my clients, with my own experience. Cal, I would like to know, what role do you see after-death communication playing in grief recovery, and how can therapists and clinicians or researchers validate these experiences, without reducing them to mere hallucination and mind is playing trick and all of those?
It's a really good question, and I think that's really where we are today, and a lot more clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, psychotherapists have started to ask questions about parapsychology and wanting to team up. And likewise, we've wanted to team up and understand more about the therapy session and what people are saying and how much they're disclosing. So I mentioned Dewi Rees as a general practitioner. None of those 293 widows and widowers were telling their GP that they'd had these experiences. They feared psychosis. And so our duty in the therapy session is not to go on the parapsychology rant. We're not looking for, was it true or not? What evidence do you have that it went beyond what we understand of psychology, albeit groups of people witnessing things or additional information that the person, the recipient, the experienced seemingly should not have had access to, and yet it turns out to be true. The question is, for the clinical setting, what did it do for them? Being someone that is open to accepting these experiences and talking about them is the first big thing for the client. Another thing is, you could relate and say, I've had these experiences too, so I perfectly understand. I completely empathize. So that's one. But another thing is also sharing information, saying you're not alone. This has been studied for a long time. You'll find that probably a lot of your friends, if you ask them, they've had something similar. They have dreamt of the dead. They probably heard their voice after they died, probably smelt their perfume or tobacco, things like that. But it's only if you ask, they will start digging into their memory banks and go, oh yeah, that did happen. Whereas they just saw it momentarily for a minute as an unusual experience at the time, probably took some comfort from it, then forgot about it. But it still made a difference because it's challenged some of their views about life and death. But for my own work, I did my first PhD looking at the psychology of hope. So hope, looking forward, holding on to things, goal attainment, and this is what I want, so how do I get it? Is hope actually there, or have I got no chance? So I was looking at everything from hopelessness to being high in hope levels. And one particular researcher that I looked at in his recent models from 1994 was Snyder, who said that you have a cognitive agency, what you want, your thought pathway, how do I get to it, and then the goal, which is the hope. And the thought pathway can break down, like, oh, I want to get this degree, but you failed some exams. Well, that's it. Well, do you quit and walk away from that hope? Or do you just re-engage yourself? You walk around that wall, you put up a ladder and you climb over it. You reset your pathway and look at another way to get to what you want. Because if you've planted that flag firmly, you need to keep your eye on where you're going and just navigate around. Don't give up. If you stumble, pick yourself up. Sit for a while. Take some time to think. All sorts of things to just readjust and reset yourself. And you're growing and developing in all of this process. How does that sit into after-death communications and the therapy setting? Well, for these people, I mentioned they could be absolute believers or absolute cynics, but if they've got into the position where they're going to disclose this to a therapist, the therapist may ask a number of questions related to this. Have you ever had an experience like this before? Have you ever read anything on this? Have you ever known a friend to have this? The person that you're grieving for, did they believe in any of this? Did they have their own experiences? All these things that open up conversation, and they start sometimes to make some of the experience for them concrete and not worried that they're going through some sort of psychosis, they're struggling to cope with bereavement, anything like that. You're actually more so getting them to think about the experience in different ways. And there are more books now in death, dying, and bereavement calling this thing the continued spiritual bond, continued bonds model, it tends to be called, where we reevaluate if we have these experiences, or sometimes not. It could just be a dream, or just the idea that, well, the person's died, but I like to think they're still looking over me and making sure I'm okay. But if you have one of these experiences, it starts to make more concrete to them that, well, maybe when I die, there is something else. Maybe I'll be reunited. This experience is giving me a little bit of suggestion that maybe, and the experiences of others, and the books, and the support from the therapist. So ultimately, for someone going through this bereavement therapy and also worrying about death anxiety, if they've had these experiences, it's starting to enter them into not a win-lose situation, but what I like to call a win-neutral situation. Because if this is all true and consciousness is surviving death in some way, then maybe win, hold on to that experience you have, embrace it and revel in its extraordinary nature and how it's made you question life. And one day, when your time is up, you'll be reunited. So win. What's the alternative? Well, it's not a lose, it's a neutral. Because if death is the way that we understand the brain and some of our thinkings of consciousness, particularly for the materialists, there's nothing. You won't even know that you've lost out because there is nothing to know. Your thought patterns, your awareness, your memory, your intellect is gone. So you won't know. So there is no harm in holding on to the other side and feeling content and positive and making goals and striving forward in your life as you move forward from all the people you've lost, friends, loved ones, pets, you name it. You keep going forward and you make yourself stronger and better and more learned from these experiences, but taking the deceased with you in various forms, in the memories that you hold, the photographs you keep, their biological lineage through their children, and the experiences that you have that are common and across cultures and across time. So the therapist can name all these kinds of things to work on to help the person, rather than say, like the parapsychologist might, I know exactly why you had this experience, let me explain to you what actually happened. That'd be taking it away from them. And they've not gone to the therapy session to have hope or positivity taken from them. They need encouragement and support. So the role of the clinical parapsychologist, clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, you name it, is to talk through these in a very unbiased but supportive setting and talk about moving forward, what it means to you, and all these other relationships as well. And saying, as the therapist, I understand these experiences. I understand the data. I understand the topic. It exists. You can look into it if you want, or just focus on your experiences. You can go so many different ways.
Cal, your work invites us to approach death not only as an ending, but as a frontier of consciousness. If we take survival research seriously, how might it change, not just how we die, but how we live? What are your thoughts?
That's a big one. I think a lot relates to what I've just mentioned about reveling in these experiences. But even when I just teach classes on death, dying, and bereavement, people were concerned when Robert Kastenbaum started producing textbooks on the psychology of death. He actually had a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics saying this is a nonsensical topic. How can you have a topic of psychology that no one knows anything about? We observe death. We don't know about the process of death because you have to die to know it. And no one, as far as they're concerned, from the death studies angle, has come back. You are then biological matter, and we've lost the psychology element. But Robert was saying, no, there's so many things. Survival is one topic, and he acknowledges that. But he said families, bereavement, the dying person, how they handle things, how you manage life and death, suicide, death through war and torture and things like that, death in the hospice, death in the funeral service. There are so many sectors where we live and breathe around death, dying, and bereavement, hospital care, graveyards and their management of a place to go and hold vigil, to mourn and remember the dead. There are so many aspects of death, dying, and bereavement that we can study, particularly death. But all of it is related to the reaction of the living. It tells us more about how we live our lives, how we readjust things, how we cope with loss. Because ultimately, if we go very Freudian and Jungian and add some Bowlby in there, we're looking at attachment theory. And we're looking at this attachment. In early life, we develop attachments for our parents and our siblings, but then later on, loved ones and our sexual partners and items as well. We love things. We love our favorite shirts, our favorite car, our items of jewelry, a painting on the wall. We love it. They're really important to us. I'd be devastated if it was gone because that attachment is broken, where it's not just because you physically own it. You're psychologically aware it's got more value to you mentally than some other things. And all of it is material matter. It doesn't really matter. Things are just as valuable as they are to you as the individual. It is sentimental or it's got a financial value to you. And it could be different for the next person. And so when we lose people, it is so different for everyone. But Robert Kastenbaum and others, they were really trying to kind of break this down and say, this is really important. The more we understand about bereavement, the more we understand about those people living and how you live a good life, how we pick up the pieces of suffering and loss and how we move forward again. So death is just one little topic and survival is as well. But if we add all of those together, you pick up a Robert Kastenbaum textbook and there must be sometimes nearly 20 chapters on different aspects of death, dying and bereavement that we can look at. And all of those together tell us how we can be better human beings, how we can live a better life, and also how we should really lessen our concerns about death being a bad thing or something negative or to run from. So parapsychology is just one tiny contribution, I feel, in there to the whole matter of death, dying, and bereavement. But they are intricately connected. D. Scott Rogo did a really good article on parapsychology, its contributions to death in Omega, the Journal of Death and Dying, in 1974. And then in 1993, the Parapsychology Foundation did a whole conference on parapsychology and thanatology, so that they do marry together very well. But all of these things are telling us about how we live better as humans.
Cal, you have worked at the crossroads of science, experience, and mystery. I mean, that's how I see your work. Now, looking ahead, what paradigm shift do you believe is most urgently needed in how we understand consciousness and death over the next decade?
I don't know how much of a shift there would be, because as I mentioned, my stance is that I'm not comfortable with the idea that people consciously survive death. There's some really compelling information for me that something is retained, elements of people's memory or intellect. And it's really kind of shaking at the gates between materialism and post-materialism. And I think there was two really good books that would fascinate viewers and listeners if they got them. One was called, it's the middle of a trilogy, it's called Beyond Physicalism. And the complementary book by the same publisher is called The Myth of the Afterlife. And they are both anthologies, so filled with chapters by various scientists. And one is absolutely saying, look at this materialist approach. Afterlife is just a no-go. And neuroscience is helping us say that that's absolutely the case. Whereas the other book is saying, well, neuroscience is actually helping us and complementing the idea that there's survival as well. And so, for me, I've mentioned it already. I think what's creating more of a shift towards progression and learning is more simply than a paradigm shift. Is just getting people talking more. Parapsychology, though, by branching into things like neuroscience, might be more on the path to coming up with a working model or theory for how things such as telepathy or precognition may be possible. How any of that survives outside of the physical brain is a bigger question. And so it's like we've got to understand more so these experiences from within the brain first that we can control in lab studies before we really start to get to grasps with the idea that any of this survives the death of the physical body. It's a really big question as to how we leap from one from the other, and also how all of this ESP is not just creating the illusion of survival for us. If ESP exists, it absolutely could do that. We call it the super ESP hypothesis. So I don't know about what paradigm shifts would need to happen. My stance, I'm going to reinforce it because I want people to just get talking, keep talking, engage, embrace skepticism, embrace people that are very open to these experiences. Just create dialogue, healthy dialogue, and sensible ideas and discussion in moving forward.
So yes, with this, we have come to the end of our podcast. Professor Cal, thank you so much. I did learn a great amount of things with this conversation, and I'm sure viewers are going to love this conversation, and it's going to be quite a knowledgeable experience for them as well. And in case, guys, if you have any question, you can comment below, and I can bring in Professor Cal again, for another topic. Whatever you guys are curious to know, he can come and educate us. So, Professor Cal, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.